This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
The proclamation of President Ebert does not seem to have been far amiss in describing the revolution in Bavaria as the work of lunatics. It appears now to have been a crazy movement, inspired and directed by persons better fitted for the entire comic opera stage than for a serious effort to overthrow the Berlin government. The New York Times, November 10, 1923. I know that Hitler, Wöhler, and Ludendorff crew. One of them, I forget who, even came here and asked me to receive him. I refused, of course, to have anything to do with them. Is it possible to be misunderstood like that? Benito Mussolini, November 9, 1924. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Nazis' political comeback in the mid-1920s. Now, usually when we as historians talk about the rise of National Socialism, talk about the way in which the movement sort of positioned itself to seize power from an electoral standpoint in 1933, we tend to skip over this period from about 1925 to 1928. The Nazi Party in these years, as we'll see, is actually pretty small. They don't have a lot of members. They don't have a lot of electoral success. And so even in something as thorough as Richard Evans' Coming of the Third Reich, there's only about 20 pages devoted to talking about this kind of period right after they've emerged from Hitler being in jail, the party being banned. And the story of how they kind of put the pieces back together again doesn't really get told, or it doesn't get told in a kind of comprehensive way. Instead, historians kind of skip ahead to the more consequential part when the Nazi Party's vote share increased from just 2.6% in the federal elections of 1928 to being the largest party in Germany by 1932. And that story, this exponential growth, occurs, of course, against the backdrop of the Great Depression. And so what you often find is people sort of explaining, how do the Nazis become popular? How do they become a sort of, again, a large mass political party? The answer is people are reacting to the Great Depression. There is, of course, a lot of truth in these explanations. But as we'll see today, they don't fully explain the Nazis' incredible political comeback. You just heard some of the quotes that I read. People looking at the situation in 1923 and 1924 look at Hitler and the Nazi Party as yesterday's news. As one New York Times article from December of 1924 put it, it's believed he'll retire to private life and return to Austria. Right? Hitler, the Nazis, they tried to seize power. The revolution is over. It failed. We're done with these people. You heard the quote from Benito Mussolini. The guy that actually goes to visit him is not Hitler or Wöhler or Ludendorff. It's Hermann Göring. But Mussolini couldn't even be bothered to remember who was this random kind of German guy that showed up, because Mussolini in 1924 looks at the Nazis as kind of clowns. Who are these people? I don't want anything to do with these. They're losers, maybe even better than clowns. There's a lot of reason for people thinking this, right? Hitler had failed in his putsch in November 1923. He had been sentenced to prison, and he served just under a year of prison time. The Nazi Party itself had been formally banned, as had its sort of paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, or SA. So how is it that the Nazi Party made such an incredible comeback? Again, the Nazi Party is not the only right-wing sort of revolutionary or national revolutionary group out there. There is a wide variety of choices. If you are a voter, if you are a sort of patriotic German citizen, and you're trying to think about, well, I don't like the Republic, I don't like socialism, I don't like communism, what can I do? Where can I invest my energies? There are a whole bunch of parties out there, parties that are better organized, better financed than the Nazi Party. Why on earth would I go back to these losers? And so what we're going to see in today's episode is that the answer to that question, a lot of it happens or falls within the period of 1925 to 1928. Now, to be clear, the Nazi Party doesn't really achieve a lot of electoral success in this period. But it is, as one could describe it, as a period of preparation, a period of laying the foundations and the groundwork for a mass movement that will blow away the other rival right-wing nationalist parties in Germany when the Depression happens. So why did the small and largely discredited Nazi Party emerge as the top alternative to the Weimar Republic in 1930? We will answer this question today, and we'll talk about how the Nazis emerged from the political wilderness. At the same time, however, today's episode is also going to explore a sort of second related theme, which is how Adolf Hitler gained mastery over the Nazi Party. Now, at a certain level, this may seem kind of obvious. We associate Hitler with what's called the Führerprinzip, right? The idea that the leader of fascism has complete power. There's no kind of checks on his or potentially her exercise of power. But if you think about it, political parties, as much as they're effective, can also distribute power very widely. They can also be burdensome or cumbersome. There's always those kind of crotchety members on either the right wing of the party or the left wing of the party, and they're kind of radicals. They don't want to toe the party line. They don't want to do what they're supposed to do. This is true of almost every political party in the world, especially if you get big enough to the point where you can actually win elections. So the question of how Hitler asserts dominance or mastery over his own political party is also a fascinating one, and it is also one that in many ways gets solved or answered again in this period of 1925 to 1928. This idea that the party and that ultimately society should really submit themselves to the leader's will, this is something that has to be negotiated. This is something that, for lack of a better word, Hitler achieves during this period that we're talking about. The establishment of the Führerprinzip is not a natural or organic element to Nazi thinking, although you can understand why they found it acceptable. But we need to note that Hitler took specific steps in the years before and after securing power, not just to build a dictatorship over German society, but also to build a dictatorship over the party. There was a process of eliminating or subduing rivals while taking personal command over the more rebellious elements of the movement that happened again before the Nazi seizure of power. Nazi Germany did experience a kind of, some would call it a counter-revolutionary moment, some would call it a kind of crackdown, if you will. There is, in the summer of 1934, this moment called the Room Purge, or the Night of the Long Knives, right? Hitler kind of goes Michael Corleone on his enemies within the party, kills a number of people inside and outside the party. But we never see the kind of sustained, bitter internal conflicts that we see, for example, in Stalin's efforts to create a dictatorship of the party in Soviet Russia. And again, part of the answer for this is because Hitler has already won those battles as the movement is sort of recoalescing or refounding itself in the mid-1920s. So again, today's episode is about how the Nazi Party was reborn in the late 1920s, but it's also going to be about how Hitler built a dictatorship over his own party. So kind of a two for today, two for one in terms of the intellectual payoff or historical payoff, if you will. Finally, just one last note before we dive into the actual history. Just a quick reminder that this is one of several episodes we've recorded on the history of Nazi Germany. If you haven't heard the previous episodes, you can find an overview of them on my website, www.historyoffthepage.com. You can also find out about some of our other episodes. We have over 20 hours that we've done on the history of Israel-Palestine. We have a long episode on the historical origins of the war in Ukraine. And we even have one about the history of Christmas. Finally, don't forget to check out our Patreon-only episodes, including The Making of Hitler and Nazism and the Occult. You can access these for just $2 a month by going to Patreon and becoming a supporter. And of course, this helps support the show. Those of you that have already done so, a big thank you. We really appreciate it. Okay, when we last left off with Hitler, he had just been released from about 9 months in captivity at the relatively comfortable Landsberg am Lech prison. During this time, of course, he has a moment to reflect, to think about what's going on. One of the things that he realizes is this idea of staging a coup, using paramilitary forces to retake Berlin by force. He realizes this is not really going to work, and so he begins to shift his idea of what the future Nazi party and its goals should look like. If you want to carry on a revolution, the way to do it is not through violence, at least not overt violence. It is to seize power legally, electorally, and then you can use the violence to maximum effect. Now, while he's in prison, Hitler has a number of visitors. There's actually more than 500 people that come to see him. He's got a lot of time on his hands, and so he decides to write kind of an autobiographical testament. It's going to lay out his kind of political vision for the future, and of course this becomes known as Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. Now, the book itself is not really that trustworthy. The autobiographical section, it's kind of like if you read someone running for president and they come out with a book about their life, they're not actually trying to tell you about their life. They're trying to set up a kind of image of them politically that will help them when it comes to a coming election. And so we should understand Mein Kampf partially in this way. Now, it also lays out the Nazi leader's worldview, and it is, of course, replete with lots of anti-Semitism, with racism, with vitriol against social democracy and communism. Hitler talks a lot about the other political parties in the Weimar Republic, and of course lambasts them as being impotent and irrelevant. He also began to introduce readers to some geopolitical theories, the most important of which is probably the idea of Lebensraum, or living space. This is an idea that he kind of picks up from a geographer named Karl Haushofer. But the idea is that the world is involved in this kind of social Darwinistic grand colonial struggle. And basically, it's a zero-sum game, and the winners are going to be the nations that secure land. And so if you're thinking about what is the colonial space left for Germany to expand into in the 1920s and 1930s, well, they're not going to go to South America. They're not going to go to North America. Africa has been pretty much gobbled up by this point. And so where is the quote-unquote virgin lands, to use a term from the Khrushchev era, where are the virgin lands that are left? It is in the East. It is Poland. It is Russia. And this, the conquest of these territories, is the key, Hitler would argue, to the future of Germany. If you want to think in geopolitical terms, the future of Germany depends on the defeat and subjugation of what he would have called Russia, but you could also call it the Soviet Union if you want. Of course, another part of Mein Kampf is talking about the Versailles Treaty and what a scandal it is, what a crime it was against Germans, and kind of laying out the idea that part of a Hitler program would be revising the Versailles Treaty in ways that were favorable to Germany. Now, the first volume of Mein Kampf comes out in 1925, and then he'll publish a second volume the next year. And a lot of times when we think about Hitler, we think about Mein Kampf, and we think about it as being kind of the definitive vision. Especially in the 1950s, there were some historians that kind of argued, well, This really lays out his plan. He was going to attack the Jews all along. But it's important to note that at the time that it's published in 1925 and 26, there really isn't widespread demand for this book. It is not a political bestseller. Obviously, some members of the Nazi Party buy it, especially those that were really into Hitler. But we can say that it only kind of meets with a sort of modest success. Part of the reason for this is that it's obviously a reflection of circumstances. Adolf Hitler in 1925 is, as I've said, kind of a loser. He's an intriguing figure for maybe some people on the political right. But for most people, he's yesterday's news. He's that guy from Bavaria that did that crazy thing that lost. So we don't need to think about Adolf Hitler in 1925 or 26. Right? How much time do you spend thinking, if you're in the United States, about the leaders of the Green Party or the Constitutional Party? These groups that get like 1%. I mean, are you sitting around going, oh my God, what is Gary Johnson talking about today? I need to know the latest developments on what Gary Johnson thinks. Or Ralph Nader even, if you want a more historical example. Right? People don't care about them. They're electoral losers, right? Move on. This is how many people thought about Hitler in 1925-26. Now, setting aside just the fact that, of course, you're coming out of this sort of catastrophe of the Beer Hall Putsch, more broadly speaking, Hitler and the Nazis faced several other challenges in terms of their ability to mount a political comeback in 1925. First, despite the fact that Hitler is now free, and Hitler is the kind of biggest draw, biggest attraction of the Nazi Party, the Nazi Party itself is still technically illegal in December of 1924. Hitler was banned from public speaking in many German states until 1927. So if he's your number one asset, your number one draw, and he can't even go to Prussia and start giving big speeches, well, that's going to be a pretty big problem for your political party. Now, the Nazi Party does get legalized in February of 1925. It does become, as we'll see, able to participate in regional and national elections. But for the most part, before 1930, the Nazi Party achieves almost no success, or even when they have their kind of big breakthrough in 1928, they're going to have a little over 2.5% of the vote in federal elections. Now, we can measure the success of a party in terms of its electoral vote share, but we should also think about it from a financial perspective. A healthy political party raises money from its donors to carry out various operations, to pay staff, to carry on political campaigns, etc. But for the Nazi Party before 1930, money is a huge problem. They don't have funds. They're not able to pay even some of the top-ranking Nazi members. People like Joseph Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler are basically barely scraping by. The primary way that they try to raise money is through memberships and through newspaper subscriptions. But again, if you have a small party, and by the way, the Nazi Party, as late as 1927, it only has 75,000 members. So you're not going to have a lot of revenue, you're not going to have a lot of resources, and you are, as I've said, kind of in the political wilderness. Things were even worse, though, than just this. If you think about the environmental factors that led to the growth of the Nazi Party in the early 1920s in Bavaria, if you think about why Hitler even decided to launch the Beer Hall Putsch, it is because of environmental factors like the Ruhr crisis and hyperinflation. Munich before 1923 is a hotbed of right-wing radicalism, is full of people like the Freikorps and ex-servicemen and right-wing reactionaries that don't like democracy, that want to bring back the Wittelsbach monarchy. But as we talked about in our last episode, by 1925, Gustav Stresemann had helped lead Germany to stability. The Ruhr crisis, which had been caused by a lack of sort of German repayment, had been sort of solved, right? Stresemann's government agrees to pay the reparations. They sign the Dawes Plan, and so they start getting these kind of cheap American loans from the United States. They use these to pay the French and the Belgians back. And the French and Belgian troops leave the Rhineland. They don't have striking workers anymore that they have to pay, or industries that are no longer producing that they have to subsidize. And so the demand that led to all the printing of money is over. Life in the Weimar Republic in 1925 seems a heck of a lot more tolerable than it did in 1923. In Bavaria itself, the government that had tolerated a lot of these sort of right-wing movements, led by people like Kahr, Lassau, and Strasser, had been replaced by a sort of more popular government, led by a guy named Heinrich Held. And he was less tolerant of these radical right-wing groups like the Nazis or the SA. So if you put all these things together, at the moment that Hitler gets out of jail, that he says, okay, we're going to refound the party, we're going to try to grow it electorally, the major issues that the Nazis had campaigned against have largely been solved. There is less urgency for a counter-revolution in Germany in 1925 than there had been from 1919 to 1923. Now, so far I've been kind of moving interchangeably between Hitler's challenges and the Nazi Party challenges, but on a personal level, Hitler also faces several internal challenges. And the biggest is the type of kind of fracturing that can happen when there's a leadership vacuum in a political movement. When you don't have the leader, who is it that everyone should follow and listen to? If you follow American politics, especially presidential politics, the party that is out of power is almost always in a very difficult position because it's impossible to know who speaks for them. Right? This is 2025. Who is the leader of the Democratic Party in the United States? Who speaks for the Democrats? Nobody knows, right? There's a bunch of people that want to do it. There's some people that think that they're doing it. We don't really know. There isn't a president of the Democratic Party. Before 2023, when basically Trump sort of came back and everything became about presidential politics in the United States, who was the leader of the Republican Party in 2021 and 2022? Was it Ron DeSantis? Was it Trump? Was it Senator Tim Scott? Who knows? There wasn't one, right? Because there was kind of a political vacuum. And then, of course, Trump came back and sort of refilled that. This is the situation that Hitler and the Nazis face in 1925. Now, Hitler, when he goes to jail, had intentionally kind of chosen not a successor, but maybe a caretaker would be the right way to put it. And so the official kind of pro tem head of the party in his absence was a guy named Alfred Rosenberg. Now, Rosenberg was a Baltic German. He was born in 1893 in what is now Estonia. And he was one of the least charismatic members of the Nazi movement. Now, I'll also say Rosenberg sounds pretty Jewish in terms of its name. He was not Jewish. He had no Jewish ancestry. As I said, he was a Baltic German. And he basically flees to Germany at the end of World War I as the Soviets come into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. He comes to Munich and he kind of hits it off with this poet and sort of folkish organizer named Dietrich Eckart. We talked about him in our episode on the rise of the Nazi Party. And Eckart and Rosenberg kind of get together. They meet Hitler. And the three of them kind of work together during the first years of the Nazi kind of movement. Eckart in particular will be the editor of the Völkischer Beobachter. And then once he dies of a heart attack, Rosenberg will take over. Now, Rosenberg, in terms of his Nazism, doesn't fit in really well with a lot of what we typically think of as the early Nazi Party members. He's not some World War veteran. He's not the sergeant, if you will, that spent time in the trenches and, did a lot of fighting. He's not really physically intimidating. He doesn't really have a lot of charisma. He's not a great public speaker, although he does make speeches. Instead, Alfred Rosenberg is kind of like an intellectual. Now, he's not a great intellectual. He's not some kind of towering mind like Nietzsche or something like that. His intellectualism is actually kind of disappointing and underwhelming if you just want to kind of judge it on the merits. So in many ways, he's kind of, I've used the word loser before to talk about Hitler. Alfred Rosenberg, from a social standpoint, in some ways, is kind of a loser. He's not someone that is going to naturally attract people behind him, and they're going to go, oh, we better follow Rosenberg. He's the guy to lead our movement. Now, Hitler probably chose Rosenberg because he was fairly inept, because he's not a natural leader, right? If I'm going to go to prison, but I want to keep control of the movement, and I think when I get out, I want to take the gang over again, then I don't want to appoint someone who's really capable and can do all this stuff that I was already doing. If I do, I run the risk of being passed by. And so Hitler probably thought of this appointment of Rosenberg as a kind of tactical decision for the short term, not as a way of ensuring the growth of the movement in the long term. Now, Hitler also explicitly says that he did this, but it's after the fact. So, is he being honest? Is he just taking credit for something that already happened? Who knows, right? But the point is that Rosenberg was not a very strong leader. Now, perhaps the biggest initial threat to Hitler's leadership was a very independently minded guy that we've already kind of talked about before, whose name was Ernst Röhm. Just to give you a quick backstory, Röhm at this point, he had fought in the army during World War I. He had become a kind of liaison figure between the army and various paramilitary groups in the immediate aftermath of World War I. By 1924, he was appointed the head of the Sturmabteilung, or the SA. And Röhm's vision, or his goal for Germany, was to carry out that counter-revolution. He wanted some kind of violent confrontation with socialists and communists and democratic forces. And his hope was that the Reichswehr, which later on gets renamed the Wehrmacht, or the German army, the hope was that this army group would come over to him, and then either through his own authority or by supporting someone else like Erich von Ludendorff, the kind of right-wing forces would seize control and carry out their own kind of revolution from above. Röhm basically gets away with participation in the beer hall putsch. He is not actually in the Bürgerbau Keller where Hitler is doing the main kind of activities on that day. Basically, he's outside in the streets of Munich. And so he isn't sent to jail after the trial is over. After the Nazi Party and the SA are banned, Röhm will try to create a new organization. This is going to be known as the Frontbahn. And the idea is that this is going to suck up all the ex-SA soldiers. So one of the things that happens after the banning of the Nazi Party and the SA is that they create kind of like shell organizations that all the former members can join. So technically speaking, it's not the SA. The insignias are a little different. The shirts are a little different. But wink, wink, it is the SA. It is the Nazi Party. So Röhm begins to put together this Frontbahn to kind of, again, suck up the members of the SA. And then he tries to work out alliances with other right-wing political leaders to, again, kind of continue this idea of a national revolution. Now, as all this is going on, Röhm tries to assert some independence from Hitler, right? You're in jail. Why the hell should I listen to you? You failed at the coup attempt. You're yesterday's news. At one point, Röhm actually writes Hitler a letter, and he says that party politics would, quote, no longer be tolerated in either the Frontbahn or the SA. Furthermore, he wrote, quote, I categorically refuse to allow SA commanders to accept instructions from party political leaders, end quote. So think about that for a second, right? If the idea was that the Nazi Party was the political sort of expression of Nazism, and the SA is going to be the paramilitary group, if you want a historical parallel, I guess the Nazi Party is supposed to be sort of like Sinn Féin, and the SA is going to be more like the IRA. Röhm is basically declaring independence from people like Hitler, who are quote-unquote political leaders. Like the SA will exist for its own purposes, not to provide protection, not to provide muscle, if you will, for political leaders. Now, as you might expect, Hitler is not very impressed by these demands. He basically counters, recognizing the danger that Röhm represented. He says basically the SA has to give up any pretense of independence. He says your only role is basically to support the Nazi Party. You are not an independent organization, even though you might be sort of from a legal standpoint. They get into this tit for tat. Röhm will offer to resign in response. And in May 1925, after Hitler's out of jail, after he starts to kind of refounding the party, Röhm will actually resign and he will leave for Bolivia in 1928, where he will serve as a military advisor. Now, in terms of his other sort of potential rivals, when we're talking about the sort of old guard of the Nazi Party, the people that were members before the Beer Hall Putsch, most of the other major figures are not in a position to kind of challenge Hitler in terms of his leadership role. Rudolf Hess, for example, basically goes and serves time in jail with Hitler, works as his sort of private secretary in many ways, has absolutely no intention of breaking with the Fuhrer, although he kind of does in 1941 when he flies to England, but we'll get into that later in the podcast. Another one of the major Nazi figures pre-1923 is Hermann Göring. Hermann Göring is wounded very badly during the fighting on the night of November 9th, 1923, so during the Beer Hall Putsch. Göring will kind of flee into exile. The German government will seize all of his assets. And so, as I said, when he shows up to see Mussolini, it's not, oh, wow, here comes Hermann Göring, I should really talk to him. It's, who is this loser who's trying to, get money from me? I don't want to talk to this guy. I don't want anything to do with these people. Finally, if you're talking about people like Heinrich Himmler, Himmler is a member of the Nazi Party in this period, but he's a super minor figure at this time. Basically, he holds one of the standards during the Beer Hall Putsch. He holds like a big flag. That's his big achievement during the Beer Hall Putsch. So from the people that were already there pre-1923, there are not many people that would have been well known that could have challenged Hitler for leadership of the party. However, there were some people that had joined and kind of worked their way up the Nazi Party ladder, or who would shortly join, that one could argue could have been major rivals to Hitler. And the most important of these figures was a guy named Gregor Strasser. Now, Strasser was born in 1892 in Bavaria. He is in many ways a Bavarian's Bavarian. Think about a guy big, tall, kind of bear-like with the big beer belly. Strasser was also very intelligent. He was a good organizer. And he rose relatively quickly from obscurity to becoming one of Hitler's main rivals within the Nazi Party. Now, like many young patriotic Germans, when World War I came around, Strasser volunteered for service. He was decorated several times for bravery, including winning the Iron Cross both first and second class. When the war was over, he joined a Freikorps unit. In fact, he actually became the commander of his own battalion. Strasser was also, as I said, very intelligent. He was studying to be a pharmacist, and eventually he did open his own pharmacy in the Bavarian town of Landshut in the early 1920s. He also gets married, starts a family. And so he seems like a very sort of stable, charismatic, powerful, capable guy. Now, in the early 1920s, as you have this kind of turbulent political scene in Bavaria, Strasser is unable to kind of step away from that. And so he joins the Nazi Party in the fall of 1922. His first assignment is not actually to be a party man, but he will actually command an SA regional unit. And by March of 1923, his clear thinking and strong organizational skills basically result in him being promoted to commander of the SA in what's called Lower Bavaria. So Bavaria is a big state, European speaking, so he becomes commander of the SA in part of Bavaria. Now again, Strasser is a smart guy, he's a big guy, but he's not just a bruiser, but he's also someone who is something of an intellectual. He has thought about the existing order, and he basically says, I don't just want to get rid of democracy, which I think is kind of impotent and ineffective, but I'm glad that the old regime is gone too. I'm glad that the old guard is gone. We here in Germany have kind of changes taking place, industrialization, and even though he's sort of, again, right-wing, nationalist, patriotic, he cares very deeply about the working man. And so when Strasser thinks about what is the future of National Socialism, he, like some other prominent Nazis like Joseph Goebbels, they tend to think about the socialist side of National Socialism as being pretty darn important. It's nationalism, but it's also socialism. And for Hitler, as we saw and as we'll see, the socialist side is not something that he is, one might say, truly dedicated to. This will become a point of friction between him and some of these other prominent Nazis, where he kind of wants to lean fully into anti-Semitism. The anti-capitalism part, not so much. We'll do anti-capitalism, but only if we understand capitalism as something Jews do and Christians don't. At any rate, to get back to the main narrative that we're covering here, after Hitler's arrest and this kind of political vacuum that it creates, Strasser began to assert an increasing, and for Hitler, alarming sense of initiative. Now, Hitler at this point had not yet decided to kind of move into electoral politics. He's still in prison. He's still writing, of course, Mein Kampf. And so it's at this point that Strasser says, look, you guys who are members of the Nazi Party, we still have elections coming up in 1924. Let's work together with other right-wing parties. Let's form a bloc. We'll call it the Völkische Sozialblock, or the VSB. And we'll have this kind of coalition attempt to seize power legally, or at least to make progress and gain power legally. The VSB, in return, says, wow, this Strasser guy, he's doing us a favor. He's trying to bring Nazis aboard. We like him. You know what? We are going to put him on our electoral list. And so he will actually be elected to the Reichstag in 1924. First, he's elected to the Bavarian parliament in the spring of 1924. Later, he'll be elected to the federal Reichstag. Strasser's efforts are pretty successful. I mentioned that he gets elected first to the Bavarian parliament and then later on to the national parliament. This is because in the federal elections of 1924, they win over 2 million votes for this kind of folkish nationalist bloc. Some of Hitler's main rivals, who are also into this idea of building a team of rivals, we could call it, if I can pun off the Doris Kearns Goodwin book, included Röhm, included Erich von Ludendorff, and included Hans Frick, who later on became a fairly significant Nazi. So in this moment of 1925, Hitler's just gotten out of jail. He's saying, okay, we got to refound the party. He's seen the rise from relative obscurity of this guy, Gregor Strasser, and a little bit his brother, Otto Strasser, and they have suddenly become stars within the Nazi party. So this is a good thing because you need stars, but you don't want someone that's going to eclipse your own star power. As we'll see, Strasser basically becomes that guy, and there are various points in the narrative when other people in Germany who want a kind of right-wing government will start to wonder, what if we could get rid of Hitler? We could replace him with Strasser. What would this Nazi alliance look like? Finally, there's one last future rival that we want to talk about here, and that is the future propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, a man whose Nazism was formed sort of more in the post-Putsch era than before it. Now, Goebbels is one of this group that we call the generation of 1900. He was technically born in 1897, but he is one of a number of kind of young men that will gravitate to Nazism, who are old enough to be aware of what's going on in World War I, and in some cases are old enough to even volunteer to serve in World War I, but they don't actually get there in time to participate in it. They're not actually World War I veterans. Now, in Goebbels' case, it's a little bit more complicated than that. He does try to volunteer and he's rejected, but Goebbels was never really the kind of model SA man, right? If you think about the SA or the SS, you think about these kind of supposed like Aryan superhumans, whatever, and they're all like over 6 feet tall and they're all, super muscular and powerful. This is not Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels was weak growing up. He had a kind of deformity in one of his feet. So he kind of limped along his whole life. It's called clubfoot. He again was very sickly growing up. Instead of playing in ball games and wrestling and training for war, like again some of his fellow classmates, basically Goebbels threw himself into intellectual endeavors. Unlike Alfred Rosenberg, who we've kind of described as being sort of a mediocre intellectual, not really someone that's going to impress people, Goebbels was actually quite intellectual and was quite culturally sophisticated. He was an outstanding student, for example, who finished his PhD by the age of 25. Now, European PhDs are a little different than American ones. You tend to finish them a little bit earlier, but still, this was pretty impressive. Now, as a young man, Goebbels did feel a clear sense of nationalism, but his political sympathies definitely leaned more to the left than they did with the nationalist right. Goebbels had read Marx and Engels long before he came across Hitler. Now, he wasn't a devotee of Marx. He wasn't Marxist, wouldn't have described himself as that. His favorite author was a guy named Fyodor Dostoevsky. Like Strasser, Goebbels was strongly concerned with the fate of the German working class. Unlike Strasser, of course, he doesn't join a Freikorps after World War I, nor does he really become anti-Semitic during or immediately after World War I. In fact, his PhD advisor was Jewish. Goebbels keeps a diary. He doesn't really talk a whole lot about Judaism in this. His advisor obviously never had a problem with him. He passed him. And so there wasn't really much of an indication that Goebbels was going to turn into a Nazi before 1923. In fact, the most important thing in Goebbels' life at this time, in his early 20s, was probably a desire for sexual fulfillment. Goebbels, if you don't know, despite his kind of physical deformities, or perhaps because of his physical deformities, was a lifelong womanizer. He basically tried to sleep with as many women as he could his entire life. And once he became propaganda minister, he was a kind of Harvey Weinstein-like figure who was constantly, saying, well, if you want to be a star, you got to sleep with me to get to the top. And he was married at the time. He had a whole bunch of kids. We'll talk about what happens to his kids later. It's very tragic. Anyway, Goebbels' political awakening basically comes in 1923, partly linked to the Ruhr crisis. Now, his primary ambition growing up had been to become a writer, but basically, like many young authors, his works don't sell. So he's kind of disappointed, but, I'll work, I'll get a job, I'll make money, I've got to impress all these women that I want to take out on dates. So he works at a bank. Working at a bank in 1923, not the best career choice ever, right? Of course, we have hyperinflation. Of course, we have the Ruhr crisis. And so Goebbels is fired in August of 1923. Goebbels says, okay, well, I'm, culturally sophisticated. I love newspapers. Maybe I can work as an editor. And so he applies to several major newspapers, and he is rejected from each and every one of them. And so it's in this moment of failure and struggle that Goebbels now begins to look for answers in some of the critical ideological currents that were common in the Weimar Republic. If you look through his diaries, for example, he begins to say that, well, I haven't failed in my career choices because I just made bad choices. I haven't failed because, well, the French are in the Ruhr and, it's hard times and, it sucks, but it's life. He begins to blame his personal failings on Jews. There is in the anti-Semitic presses at this time in Germany accusations. Jews control the banks, the Rothschilds, of course. Jews control the press. And so Goebbels begins to soak this in. He begins to kind of become interested in anti-Semitism. He also starts reading sort of these nonfiction political works that express notions of kind of cultural decline. One of the big bestsellers in this period is Oswald Spengler's Decline and Fall of the West. He also picks up Houston Stewart Chamberlain's Foundations of the 19th Century, which we've talked about in other episodes, but brief refresher, basically was published in 1899. Chamberlain is a member of Wagner's Bayreuth Circle, and his book basically argues that history is a product of sort of this Jewish Aryan struggle for civilization. So Goebbels, by this point, is already sort of drifting down this path. And then in February and March of 1924, he reads accounts of Hitler's trial at Munich, and this convinces him that the Nazi Party, and Hitler in particular, are the way to go to save Germany. Now, even though he was kind of interested in Hitler at this period, again, Hitler's in jail, what are you going to do? Goebbels actually becomes involved in some of these sort of parallel efforts to reconstitute a Nazi-like party or alliance. His first sort of formal position, for example, came later that year when he took over editorship of a 4-page journal known as the Völkische Freiheit. The paper was supportive of the Nazi successor alliance, which was known as the National Socialist Freedom Movement. And in August of 1924, Goebbels even helps to found a chapter of this new alliance in the ruhr town of Mönchengladbach. Here he will not just sort of stay behind the scenes and work on the paper, but he starts speaking at rallies, and he earns the reputation of being an accomplished speaker. Again, like Strasser, Goebbels is a rising star relatively quickly, coming out of obscurity, has slightly different ideas about what the movement should do to Hitler. And so if you're Hitler at this point, you look at him and you say, well, this guy's a rival. What am I going to do about it? In February 1925, when the Nazi Party is re-legalized, Goebbels will join the party again. Acting on a friend's recommendation, Gregor Strasser hears, there's this guy in the kind of Rhineland. He's really capable, he's smart, he's a good organizer. And so Strasser will appoint him as the business manager for the Northern Rhineland Gau, or basically this sort of small administrative unit in the Rhineland. Now, kind of underneath the surface here, another thing going on in terms of potential rivals for Hitler, Gregor Strasser is appointing his own people. He is building his own power base in the north, people who see Nazism in a similar way that he does. And so from Hitler's perspective, you are again creating rivals. As all these developments are taking place across the summer of 1924, the rise of Strasser, the rise of Goebbels, the machinations and declarations of independence from Ernst Röhm, Hitler again becomes anxious about his control over the movement. And again, we've laid out, there's a lot of reasons for this, but Strasser will continue to push things into 1925 and 1926. Perhaps the most important moment of sort of Strasser again breaking free of Hitler occurs in September 1925, when he forms a group called the National Socialist Working Group, which is this kind of loose organization of Nazi Gauleiters, or kind of regional leaders. And the purpose of the working group is to rethink and re-express Nazi ideology. Now, on the surface, that might not sound like such a big deal, but again, if you think about some of the people involved in this, people like Strasser, people like Goebbels, their understanding of what National Socialism is one that puts more of an emphasis on socialism than what Hitler wanted to do. For example, some of these Nazis said, we need to nationalize industry. We need to take over noble estates. The idea of private property under National Socialism, in their view, shouldn't be sacrosanct. We need to carry out, they would argue, a little bit of class warfare. And of course, Hitler doesn't like the idea of class warfare. Hitler is very anti-Marxist. Goebbels in particular says, hey, we ought to abolish the stock market. That's not a road that Hitler wants the Nazi Party to go down. It's certainly not a road that many of his sort of supporters in what we might call big business, or some of the big wealthier nobles that supported the Nazi movement before 1923, they don't want to go down this path. And so Hitler has a kind of immediate reason to clamp down on these sort of radicals who are working towards their own ideas of what National Socialism is. To accomplish this task, Hitler basically pursues a number of strategies. The first is basically to distance himself from these emerging efforts in 1924 to form an alliance of right-wing parties. Even at this early stage, even from this experience he had with the beer hall putsch, Hitler is wary of the idea of alliances. Because if I have an alliance with a bunch of different groups, well, now the leaders of those groups have to get together and they have to negotiate things, and there might be rivalries, and Hitler doesn't get to make decisions for everyone else. And so he understands from a very early point in the story, I need to be in charge of everything. I need to control everything. And therefore, if I don't get my way, then I'm just not going to participate in whatever the sort of alliance system is. To drive home the point of his personal importance to the Nazi movement, in July 1924, when the party is technically banned, he actually resigns from it. He said, I don't want to be a part of this alliance making. And so it's in this moment that people like Ludendorff, people like Albrecht von Graefe, they invite Strasser to join them at the head of a new front. Now, of course, the most important effort to evolve the Nazi Party that occurs while Hitler's in jail is the attempt to found the National Socialist Freedom Movement. And Strasser, as we said, will play ball with this, right initially. Now, as would happen many times in his life, Hitler's gambit to distance himself from the Völkisch Bloc, or again the National Socialist Freedom Movement in 1924, proves prescient. Once Stresemann kind of takes control, once they begin implementing some of his reforms, once the economic conditions begin improving, the Völkisch Bloc loses about half of its votes. Within the scope of a single year, it will actually dissolve itself. And so all of the major ideological competitors to Nazism basically either collapse or they remain too small to threaten the movement in 1924-25. By stepping back and not participating in them, Hitler has proven his importance to the cause, and more people like Strasser will eventually come back and say, yes, we dedicate ourselves to Hitler. At the same time, Hitler also made efforts to win the loyalty of these potential rivals. On February 17, 1925, for example, he meets with Strasser, and he says, look, I know you were involved in this National Socialist Freedom Movement, but you really belong with us in the Nazi Party. What kind of deal can we do to kind of put things back together? And so the deal they work out leads to Strasser being appointed as the main Nazi organizer for all of northern Germany. In some ways, this makes a lot of sense. Strasser, at this point, as we mentioned, has been elected to the Reichstag. And because of that, you basically get to travel for free on trains. There are a lot of trains that go in and out of Berlin. And so it makes it easy for him, at a moment when the Nazi Party is basically broke, they don't have a lot of money, Strasser can travel around all over the north, he can organize, he can give speeches. Strasser also, as we mentioned, is more interested in the kind of socialist side of National Socialism. Well, what is there in the northern part of Germany, in both Berlin and especially in the Rhineland? There's a lot of working class Germans. There's a lot of workers. And so this is where he wants to be. And they basically allow him to have a pretty strong hand over events in the northern part of Germany. Now, for Hitler, this arrangement basically kills two birds with one stone. Sending Strasser to build the party in the north is a great idea because Strasser, as we said, is pretty talented. The Nazi Party before 1924 is not very strong in the north. It doesn't really have working class roots or members in places like Berlin, places like Dusseldorf, places like Köln. And so moving Strasser out there is, from a strategic standpoint, a good idea for the party. But it's also really good for Hitler. Because while Strasser is away in Berlin, Hitler can now promote and influence a new generation of Nazis who are going to owe their loyalty not to Strasser, who is far away, you don't see him very often, but they will owe it to Hitler, who you do see all the time. The beating heart of the Nazi movement, the bureaucratic heart of the Nazi movement, is still in the South in Munich. And so most of the key Nazis are going to be there. Hitler can keep an eye on them. Hitler can develop personal relationships with them. Strasser is going to be cut off from the main sections of power in the party. Just to give you an idea of how important this is, one of the things that happens is that because Strasser is from Bavaria, he is nominally still in charge of a local Gau in Bavaria itself, but he's just not there most of the time. And so his deputy, this guy named Heinrich Himmler, will basically take over running the district party. How does Heinrich Himmler work his way up and become an important Nazi? Part of it is because he steps into the vacuum opened by Strasser being relocated to the north. But we'll talk about Himmler a lot more later. Now, Hitler also used this same type of tactic to recruit and win over Joseph Goebbels. Again, as we talked about, in 1925, there are a number of prominent Nazis led by Strasser who are saying we should revise the party program. Joseph Goebbels is one of these people. But instead of arguing with him, instead of berating him or firing him or relocating him, Hitler realizes his value to the movement and says, I am going to start a charm offensive to win over this impressionable young man. He basically has Goebbels come over for a couple meetings. The meetings, they never talk about ideology. They don't get into, well, here's where we disagree, or I think you're wrong here. Hitler says, I'm going to basically allow Goebbels to project whatever beliefs he wants onto me. Remember, Mein Kampf is just come out, so it's not like, there's the big kind of ideological thing for Goebbels to work against. So Hitler says, look, you think whatever you want to think of me. I'm going to flatter you. I'm going to tell you what an amazing speaker you are. And coming from Hitler, that's a pretty big compliment, right? Hitler's obviously a very good speaker himself. He treats, as Goebbels describes it in his diaries, he treats Goebbels like an old friend. And Goebbels is totally blown away by this. If you read his diaries, he talks about Hitler's big blue eyes and how wonderful they are, and the emotional bond that the two have together. When he gets back from one of the early meetings with Hitler, he notes how, quote, this man, meaning Hitler, has everything it takes to be a king, the born tribune of the people, the coming dictator, end quote. Later on, he will continue to kind of recruit Goebbels. He will let him use his car. The two will go on kind of sightseeing tours together. And so Hitler has, it sounds weird to say this, but Hitler doesn't yell at people and scream at people all the time. He has a very good sense of when do I use the carrot and when do I use the stick. And so with Joseph Goebbels in 1925-26, Hitler uses the carrot all the time, personal charm, and he really wins over Goebbels to the project. Now, I mentioned just a second ago how one of the keys to what Hitler does is not stepping in to fight about ideology right away. In fact, even though Hitler was writing Mein Kampf, Hitler has a tendency to say, I don't want to micromanage policy at the local level or ideology at the local level. What I'd rather have is people kind of making their own adjustments and then fighting with each other about it. So if you're Joseph Goebbels, the people that you hate are not Hitler, it's other people in the quote-unquote Munich clique that are supposedly influencing him and convincing him to do things you don't like. And so when this NS working group starts, Hitler allows it to function. He doesn't really say much about it. It's kind of like, as long as you agree that I'm the one in charge, you guys can talk about whatever you want. And I'll put my foot down when I feel like it's necessary. In terms of the NS working group, that moment comes in February of 1926. He again becomes a little bit wary about Strasser, a little bit wary about some of the ideas that he's hearing coming out of this working group. And so he therefore calls a major meeting of Nazi figures in the Bavarian town of Bamberg. Bamberg is kind of in the northern part of Bavaria, northeastern part. Now, when he brings these people in for this meeting in Bamberg, which is known as the Bamberg Conference, Hitler does not use the charming side of things. Instead, he goes on this at least 2-hour diatribe, yelling, screaming, demolishing the arguments of all of the assembled people, and basically kind of rejecting this idea of National Socialism as a form of socialism. And this strategy pays off quite handsomely. When he's done, Strasser basically just gets up there and rather than saying, well, okay, I'm going to, offer these counterpoints or this is what we should do, Strasser just basically says, okay, everybody, give me your draft of the program. I'm going to dispose of it. We'll just pretend like this never happened and we'll just, turn back the clock and everybody's going to be on board with Hitler. Someone like Joseph Goebbels, who had been so passionate about some of these ideas, doesn't even speak. Can't even muster the courage to say anything. He's so devastated. At first, he's kind of angry at Hitler, and then he'll kind of come to accept it. So the Bamberg Conference, as it was known, was clearly a major victory for Hitler. It was an opportunity to remind everyone in the party of his absolute authority over the movement. Now, this is key, right? Because again, we tend to think about Hitler as being a crazy person, yelling, screaming, spitting all the time, veins bulging out of his face. But Hitler, again, also knows when to use the charm. After he berates sort of Strasser and his ideas, at the end of the meeting, he goes and he puts his arm around Strasser. He says, look, we're comrades. We're in this together. Stay with us. In some cases, he even rewards some of the people involved in the meeting. Some of the people that were at the block, he moves them around, moves them up the Nazi hierarchy in ways that make them feel better about themselves. In the spring of 1926, for example, Strasser is appointed to be the national propaganda leader. This then, of course, opens a position in Berlin, and rather than assigning someone from Munich, Hitler appoints Joseph Goebbels to be the new head or Gauleiter of the Berlin region in October 1926. And as we'll see in a moment, this is one of the most fateful decisions that Hitler takes in this period. Because Goebbels is not only a gifted speaker, not only something of an intellectual, but he is also a tremendous political organizer who will understand modern politics and modern media and mass communication in ways that maybe are even more advanced than some people today that are involved in politics. We'll get to that in just a second. But before we do, we also want to talk about some of the changes going on internally in the Nazi Party that kind of set the Nazi Party up to become a mass political movement. The old party had basically been based primarily in Bavaria. The main idea behind the party was to rally people for this coming kind of counter-revolution, this violent seizure of power, paramilitary forces. But that's not really what the Nazi Party needs to become if it's going to win electoral success. If you want to win electoral success, you've got to compete nationally. You can't just be based in Bavaria. If you want electoral success, you need for the center of the political party to be able to exert some power over its different areas that are around. And I'll get to this more in just a second. So by 1925, Hitler's basically decided to seize power electorally. This means, again, you have to build a party that can compete nationally, and you have to centralize that party around yourself so that Hitler can enjoy maximum control over the movement. We can see evidence of some of this already in the first steps that Hitler takes in 1925 once the party is relegalized. First, he adds to the party program the requirement that all members had to submit themselves unconditionally to his judgment. One of the mistakes that happens in the Soviet Union is some high-ranking Bolsheviks think that even though they're on board with Stalin, even though they support Stalin as the kind of leader of the Politburo, they think they can still exert independent thought. They think that they still get to have some choice or some say in the larger decisions of the party. And this is why Stalin launches the Great Purge. Hitler, from a very early period, wants to make it abundantly clear that if you join the Nazi Party, you do it to serve, you don't do it to express your own opinion. There's another element to this process of centralization that I just want to note that is worth kind of going into some depth about before we talk about the changes that kind of addressed it. And this is what we might call the franchisee problem or the McDonald's problem. And I use that reference because it came up with the story of the foundation of McDonald's in the 1950s, where basically one of the innovations they had was not just the idea of quick service, but this idea of franchising. The problem, however, is that once they started franchising, the different franchisees decided to go in their own direction. So maybe you have a McDonald's that obviously has cheeseburgers, but this other McDonald's says, well, we want chicken. Or we're going to offer fried fish because we have a lot of Catholics in the area and they want to eat fish on Fridays. So how do you maintain control over your franchisees? This becomes a huge issue, first for McDonald's in the 1950s, but also for a political party. We've already seen this Nazi working group in the North, this idea of thinking about the National Socialism, increasing the socialist side of things. You don't want that if you're Hitler. So you have to centralize the party to get control over those franchisees, which are basically the local chapters of the movement. To solve this problem, Hitler ironically borrowed heavily from the communist model. In 1926, the party was organized into 23 and later on into 32 gaus or districts, each of which roughly corresponded to an electoral district. Each one of these districts was led by a district supervisor, which was called a Gauleiter, or the kind of regional leader, and that Gauleiter was directly appointed by Hitler. So they owe their loyalty to Hitler. To drive home their lack of agency, an April 1926 memorandum demanded pre-approval by party headquarters of all propaganda material issued by local chapters. And there's actually kind of like a middle group in here. So the lowest level of organization is the Ortsgruppe, and above them there are sort of these things called Kreise, or sort of like regional districts, and above them are the Gaus, which correspond to the electoral districts. So the new party regulations called for each local party or Ortsgruppe to create its own propaganda cell. But these cells don't function based on what the Gauleiters tell them necessarily. Their job is to take orders directly from Munich in order to carry out the political agitation that Munich specifies. So you guys are not each coming up with your own propaganda, your own leaflets, your own articles in the journals. We will tell you what to push and when to push it, and this makes it more effective. Meanwhile, the party also requires those Gauleiters to develop clear strategies for political agitation. So the idea is that they will figure out when is the best time to march, who do we want to have speaking on a given topic. So it's not all fully centralized. There is some wiggle room by region, but all of the chains of command, all of the power structures flow through Munich, which is the headquarters of the Nazi movement, as opposed to developing their own independent styles, their own independent ideas. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a future episode when we talk about the Nazi electoral machine. But here I just want to note the ways in which these efforts were again centralized. First with ties to party headquarters, and then of course directly to Hitler himself. Finally, to wrap this thought up, Hitler formalized a variety of actions designed to cement his role as the movement's Führer, to basically build a cult of personality long before the seizure of power. He does this in a number of ways, some of which are kind of more exciting than others. One of the most basic things he does is he says, okay, we have bylaws. The Nazi Party is a party. It has not a constitution, but a set of organizing documents. He says, look, we're going to make clear that the position of party chairman functions independently of the National Executive Committee. So usually in a political party, usually in a kind of larger organization, you have a kind of board, and the board's job is to sort of keep tabs on whoever the leader is, right? If you're talking about, I'm at a university, there's a board of trustees. They help hire the president makes decisions, but they still have to come back to the board of trustees to get kind of approval, especially when you're talking about like a big decision. You could think about this also with the CEO and a board of a corporation. Hitler makes very clear from this early point that the chairman is independent and above the National Executive Committee. This is in many ways even a stronger position than what Mussolini achieved in Italy. Technically, there is a kind of fascist council that can sort of remove Mussolini from power, and that's eventually what happens to him. We talked about this, of course, in our episodes on Mussolini. Now, another thing that they do is cultural. Borrowing from the Italian fascists, in 1926, they make the Nazi salute compulsory for all party members. So you have to go up to each other and say, Heil Hitler. You have to write on your, things at the end instead of, saying, with friendly greetings, so-and-so. You have to use Hitler's name in that, right? And so the idea of the leader is not just a political figure that you talk about when you're talking about political things or party things, but the political leader becomes integrated into daily life. It's hard not to think about Hitler as a rock star if you are a Nazi in the 1920s, because you are already trying to sort of treat his name in a way that's different from how you treat everybody else. Another thing the party does in the mid-1920s is that when it stages its refounding conference in Weimar in 1926, it doesn't engage in discussions over the political platform. If you remember political conventions in the United States before Donald Trump, there was always this kind of debate, this fight over the party platform. What do we stand for? What are we against? Are we going to put abortion in there? Are we going to put gay rights? And so even though you had these kind of presidential kind of conventions that would happen every 4 years, a lot of behind the scenes energy went into arguing about the party platform. In Weimar in July 1926, Hitler says, we are not going to get lost in these kind of parliamentary discussions. We're fascists. We don't discuss stuff. Instead, I will make all of the ideological decisions as the Führer. You guys, our job here is not to make decisions and think about what Nazism is. It is actually to perform Nazism, to showcase the power of Nazism, to showcase the idea of unity within the movement. To be blunt, the idea of a party congress to Hitler in 1926 is not about organization primarily. It is about propaganda. It is a show. It is a performance. It is an attempt to convince other people in other parts of Germany what Nazis stand for, as opposed to being an effort to work out or negotiate what Nazism actually means to Nazis. We can see this in a number of ways. Why are they in Weimar? Well, obviously, you're talking about the Weimar Republic. If you are against the Weimar Republic, if you want to replace the Weimar Republic, having your big meeting in Weimar makes a lot of sense. We'll develop a nice contrast. Now, the Nazis also choose Weimar because Thuringia, which is a German state, is one of the few states that Hitler in 1926 is publicly allowed to speak in. So there are some practical considerations here as well. In 1927, Hitler will be able to speak in Bavaria again, and so they will decide to hold these rallies in a town called Nuremberg. They picked Nuremberg because it has a sort of very significant medieval legacy. A lot of the medieval buildings at that time are still there. And so the idea is we're going to go back and not just organize ourselves as a party, but we're going to celebrate what it means to be a German, what it means to be a Nazi. When they carry on this conference, by the way, it is not just a big party, but they meticulously kind of micromanage all of the things going on in order to produce this kind of seamless image of power and order. SA men, for example, are given a strict schedule to follow, and they're prohibited from smoking while they're kind of participating in official activities. Who would have thought that the Nazis were the ones who, kind of realized smoking was a bad thing 80 years before they started banning smoking in public everywhere in the United States? They also put together elaborate processions. If you've ever seen images, usually this is from a movie called Triumph of the Will, which is from a later party conference. But as you know, the Nazis love marching around with giant flags and banners. They have about 2,000 party members that will march through the streets of the town. They will sing songs. They will create sort of symbols of the movement. They will dedicate banners and talk about, blood flags and try to remember what happened in 1923. But again, a lot of what they're doing here is not meant to be internal, it's meant to be external. And to the degree that it was internally focused, the idea here is not to kind of flush out Nazism or fascism as an ideological doctrine. Instead, it is based on social interactions. We are going to live the Germany that we want to see. We are going to bring people together from all across the nation and celebrate their Germanness. It is, one could argue, a way of celebrating or performing the national community that many Germans, Nazi or otherwise, wanted to see. Finally, before we get to the story of how the party expanded so rapidly after 1928, we need to discuss a little bit more its bureaucratic expansion. Now, I know for most of you, when we talk about the idea of a bureaucracy, your first thoughts are about the DMV. I had to stand in line for 2 hours just to return my license plate. What on earth is that? How on earth is that efficient? Why not just let me just drop it off? I'll pin a form to it. I'll put it in an envelope. Why does it take so long to go to the DMV? When you think of bureaucracy, you often think of red tape. I want to do something. I want to build something. Why do I have to have my HOA approve the shed that I want to put up in my backyard? It's not hurting anyone. It doesn't involve them. Why do I need a government permit before I can dig? But bureaucracies, one could argue, are also extremely powerful. They enable organizations to project power over great distances and specific points. And the Nazi Party in the mid-1920s, which is living in this kind of poverty, in this moment that Hitler is kind of centralizing his power within the movement, the Nazi Party cleverly begins to build the kind of powerful bureaucracy that will not only have an electoral impact, but which ultimately basically begins to build the foundations of a totalitarian society. The Nazis will, after they seize power, take over a lot of public and kind of civic organizations. But one of the keys to doing that is that they already had Nazi versions of those civic organizations in place before the seizure of power. The first steps in this direction, one could argue, was the creation of a Reich Party directorate under the leadership of Rudolf Hess in the fall of 1926. The directorate created a number of sort of specialized offices, and these were designed to mirror the ones run by the official German government. So even though the Nazi Party at this point has like less than 2% of the vote, they have really nobody in the parliament, maybe a handful of delegates. They create a party department for foreign affairs, a party department for agriculture, for labor, for interior. The Nazis will also begin to create a number of new auxiliary formations that could better focus or organize specific groups within the movement. In 1926, for example, Gregory Strasser had helped create the Deutsche Frauenorden, or basically the German Women's Order, which creates a form for helping politically educate Nazi women. I know when we think of Nazis, if I say picture Nazis, you always picture men, right? They're all men. All the SA guys are men. The masculinity is a big part of the appeal of joining the SA. But what about women? There are millions, literally millions and millions of women in Germany. There are quite a few that like Nazism. They get to vote. They have some power. So why not organize them, right? You want to keep certain gender divisions because especially the Nazis are supposed to be kind of more right-wing, more reactionary, right? They're against Weimar modernism and feminism and the new woman and all that. But you got to give women a place to go if they're going to become politically active. Well, the Nazis create a group that will end up becoming the NS Frauenschaft. or basically the Nazi women's organization. Another example that some of you will be at least somewhat familiar with, you've heard of them before, is the youth movement. Now, there was a Nazi youth movement before 1923. It, like the SA, gets banned, and so it kind of goes underground. But they will recreate it in 1926. They will rename it the Hitler Youth, because we are now focusing on the cult of personality. And by 1930, the Hitler Youth has over 25,000 teen members. What do we do with all these young people? We can't just take a teenager, a 14-year-old, and stick him in the SA. We can't just put him into a big meeting and he's going to listen to Hitler speak for 2 hours and then he's going to, join the party and pretend like he has a job even though he doesn't. Well, they create a Nazi organization to harness that enthusiasm, to harness those people and give them a place to go controlled by the party. I've talked about women and children so far. The Nazis create all kinds of these types of professional and civic organizations. There's going to be a Nazi club essentially for doctors, a Nazi club for lawyers, a Nazi organization for professors. And when you put them all together, they will again provide the foundations for a totalitarian society, or one could argue the takeover of many civic institutions in society. Now, there's one last bureaucratic organization that I want to briefly mention. This is the Schutzstaffel, or SS. The Schutzstaffel is also founded in 1925. It basically starts out as a sort of small bodyguard unit for Hitler. I'll do a more sort of complete history of the SS for a Patreon-only episode. But here, I just want to note that the SS starts out as this small organization. Eventually, Heinrich Himmler will become involved in it, and he will try to build it out as a way of creating an elite group for the Nazi movement. So all movements, people like hierarchy. Even if you're in an egalitarian society, at some point, right, a lot of times people like some sort of idea of elite, the best of the best. And so essentially, this is what becomes the SS. It will be the sort of more advanced version of the SA, except it will always be loyal to Hitler. Now, in the mid-1920s, when it's formed, it's extremely small. We're talking about somewhere between 250 to 1,000 members, depending on the year that you're talking about. But its influence will slowly begin to grow in the late 1920s, again as it demonstrates continued loyalty to Hitler. In 1927, Himmler will become its deputy commander, and he will immediately begin sort of working on professionalizing it, expanding it. And of course, as we'll see in the Patreon-only episode, it becomes this massive organization with its own army, its own intelligence services. It's involved in sort of racial stuff. It's running the concentration camps. And so we'll explore that in a later Patreon-only episode. Okay, so as we've seen, by the spring of 1928, the Nazi Party had largely emerged from the political wilderness. After the debacle of the Beer Hall Putsch, its leaders, especially Hitler, had embraced the idea of seizing power legally or electorally rather than trying to launch another coup. Thus, they were tolerated once again by the national and regional German governments, although there were variations in terms of when this happened based on the state that you're talking about. The Nazis also began to create a more sophisticated party bureaucracy, replete with specialist organizations meant to attract diverse segments of the German electorate. Most crucially, the post-Putsch crisis of leadership had been settled fairly bloodlessly, with Hitler once again asserting his personal authority over the entire movement. Potential rivals such as Gregor Strasser or Joseph Goebbels had been co-opted, adding to the movement's power rather than detracting from it through personal squabbles. The only real holdout in the mid-1920s against Hitler's authority was Ernst Röhm, but by 1928, he had moved to Bolivia and he was off of the scene. And yet, we should not overestimate the Nazi Party's strength in the mid-1920s. There was room for considerable growth, obviously, but the party itself was at this period still quite small. In 1925, the Nazi Party had just 27,000 members. By 1927, they would have 75,000. And even into the Depression era, it would have just 130,000 members. We are not talking here about a movement that is comparable to the communists, who had millions of followers. We are not talking here about a movement that is comparable to the Social Democratic Party, which also had millions of people, or the Center Party, or even some of the other left and right-wing sort of nationalist parties. In terms of political power, the National Socialist Freedom Party, the successor alliance that I mentioned, that included this group of folkish parties, and they come together. Strasser was involved. How successful are they in the December 1924 federal elections? They get just 3% of the vote. This places them 8th in the electoral standings. Of course, that party or alliance breaks up. The Nazi Party is so weak in 1925 that they don't even field a presidential candidate. The closest they came to it was Erich von Ludendorff. Ludendorff does so poorly in the first round of voting that he drops out, and they people start recruiting Hindenburg to jump in. Between 1924 and 1928, the period that we've been talking about in this podcast, there are 10 provincial regional elections, and the Nazis do not exceed 4% of the vote in a single one of them. Even when the Nazis appear to have their first big breakthrough in the 1928 federal elections, they still come up about 100,000 votes short compared to what was the case in 1924. So even though they are themselves more powerful, they've lost ground versus what that alliance had been able to achieve. They finished 9th in the polls in 1928. By contrast, the communists, even though we're talking about the period before the Great Depression, the communists win 10.6% of the vote that year and get over 3 million votes. So in many ways, while Hitler and his movement had survived into the late 1920s, they were still not thought of as the primary political threat to the existence of the Republic. As we know, of course, like a metastasizing cancer, the Nazi movement would soon experience exponential political growth, fueled by the difficult conditions of the Great Depression. How the Nazis managed to pull this off, to build an electoral machine capable of winning the hearts and minds of millions of Germans, how they became the principal alternative to democracy and to socialism or communism, versus all these other kind of smaller but in some ways better equipped parties in 1928 to 1930, how they managed to pull this off will be the subject of our next episode, which will cover the period roughly from 1928 to 1930. So that's going to be it for now. If you've enjoyed listening or found the material helpful, please like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also tell your friends and family about us. It's incredibly helpful. I love it when I go on Reddit or something and I see somebody recommending some of the podcast episodes. It's great for us. Hopefully it's great for the people that are now listening to it, that are finding it. So again, it's just incredibly helpful, and we really appreciate it when you do that. If you have a moment, go on Spotify, go on Apple, give us a 5-star rating. Again, that just helps us to get the word out and helps us show up in the algorithms. So again, to wrap up, thank you for listening, and we hope you join us next time as we take history off the page.